Well, once you invade, once you have military forces on the ground, the non-military options are much harder to apply, if not impossible, because the military becomes so overwhelming that the idea that the United States or the West is going to be involved in nation building doesn't work so well. So I don't think you could have done nation building things in Iraq before the invasion either. I'm not saying that there's no either or here. But given where we are now, as the troops pull out, I would assume that there could be an interest, particularly in Iraq, in terms of doing some activities which would help the government and the existing society strengthens itself, democratize itself, deal with internal conflict and the like. But probably as long as you have this overwhelming foreign policy, national security, military endeavor going on, it's going to be very, very difficult to do those things, except in the context of the American presence. Well, in a post-conflict situation or in a conflict situation, there's a multitude of things that could be done that are complementary. There certainly is a diplomatic option, which involves having your diplomats, your people from your embassy, negotiating, working with the host government. Treaties have to be negotiated on the official level. They're the only people who can do it. But that can be supported by the presence of military peacekeepers, which the UN specializes in, which the United States to a lesser extent is getting involved in, where you provide security to a peace process as opposed to a military endeavor. And then there can be a massive NGO, non-governmental organization contribution. This is where organizations like my own work. And what we can do is everything from radio programming, television programming, which supports bringing people together. We do a lot of soap opera production, for example, which with the end of resolving conflict, promoting mutual understanding, you can do the same kind of TV, radio production in order to fight HIV/AIDS. You can use it to change attitudes about behavior and the like. You can promote democracy. There's all sorts of things that could be done. I would see it as a 3 or 4-legged stool, of which there's a diplomatic part, a military part, an NGO part, and the fourth part, which is harder to get in, is the business part, the economic part. And international organizations sometimes have both the reach and the international credibility that they can do things that the U.S. government can't do, and you want to mix these things skillfully together. There's no single answer. It should be a lot of parallel efforts working together, probably loosely coordinated, because tightly coordinated doesn't work, though there are people who would like to tightly coordinate it. But people should be talking to each other. There can be forum, there can be meetings, there can be ways of coming together. And all of that together is a recipe for peacemaking. Preventive action works much better than after the fact, picking up the pieces, post-conflict kind of action. It's the same in medicine. Preventive medicine is much better than, say, open heart surgery. And you want to do these things, you want to apply tools preventively in order not to have to send in 100,000 or 500,000 American troops. On the other hand, in a place like Afghanistan, I'm not so much sure what you could have done with the Taliban because they probably wouldn't have let you come in. But I know in a place like Burundi, where we worked for years, you can do a huge number of things preventively which have stopped the worst from happening. And that's how preventive action can be applied. There's no single off-the-shelf solution to these questions. Every country needs to be thought of differently and takes a different set of tools. So to get into Somalia today would be very difficult. To get into DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, is much easier. And you want to find it so the way you work in Somalia is very much different than the way you work in DRC. We went into Burundi right after the genocide in Rwanda, about 6 months later. And Burundi, which is next to Rwanda, has the same ethnic mix and was on the point of going the same way as Rwanda. And so we put together what we called a societal approach to conflict prevention. And it included the following. We did about 15 hours of radio broadcasts a week. In other words, we started a radio studio that included Hutu journalists and Tutsi journalists. And they did the news together, they did features, they did music programs, and they did a lot of soap opera. And the idea was to put values into the society that would get people thinking in different terms. And outside evaluators found we were able to change the way most Burundians thought of questions like negotiation, reconciliation. In other words, we were able to change the political vocabulary. In addition to that, we worked with hundreds of women's organizations to try to develop and empower women as peacemakers. The idea was that women don't do the killing, women pick up the pieces in a conflict like this, and that they could be a powerful force for not having war. You very rarely would find women who will kill for reasons of saving face, which is unfortunately is not true of men, of which I am one. But so we did a lot of work with women's associations, and men too. We did a lot of cultural kinds of things. In Burundi, there's a national passion for drumming. We sponsored a national drumming contest for peace. And it ended at the national stadium with the whole country essentially listening on the radio. There was virtually no television to watch it. And the idea was to get the leading drummers in the country to come together around the notion of not having an outburst, a conflagration or something like that. And then we worked behind the scenes. We had a high-level South African member of the parliament down there who spent about 7 years going back and forth between the parties, the people that the diplomats wouldn't talk to and some of them who they were. So everybody from the president of the country to the head of the rebel groups, he was talking to. And he was working, he was facilitating, he was listening, he was changing. And I don't think there's a conflict in the world that doesn't benefit from such an input. We call it domestic shuttle diplomacy. Shuttle diplomacy without the airplane. I think the international community does have a responsibility to prevent certain things from happening and to protect people. How far it goes in terms of the sovereignty of the country and how awful the thing they're protecting against are questions I don't have a strong sense of. But I know when there's a genocide going on, say in Rwanda, there is a responsibility to protect. I think you can do a lot before you get up to that point, though. In other words, one of the problems with preventive action, preventive diplomacy, is there isn't a country in the world that really does it. What happens is everybody puts their money and resources into today's crisis. Preventing tomorrow's crisis is something that is not being done systematically. So even if there is money in the budgets of the State Department or whatever, it winds up going to the Iraqs and Afghanistans, not to tomorrow's crisis. And so preventive action is something that is talked about widely in foreign ministries but not acted upon.